Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience and for waiting for a couple of minutes this morning. On behalf of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Equator Initiative, the United Nations Development Program, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the Indigenous Women's Network on Biodiversity, and the MBSAT Forum, I welcome you all to the webinar series on integration of Article 8J and provisions related to Indigenous peoples and local communities in the work of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, and its protocols. My name is Eva Gurria from the United Nations Development Program, and I will be co-moderating today's webinar with my colleague John Scott from the CBD Secretariat. Diego Ochoa, also from UNDP and the MBSAT Forum team, will be providing technical support during this webinar. Thank you very much, Diego. Well, today's webinar will be very interesting and will cover a lot of content related to Article 8J of the CBD. And we will have an impressive group of speakers that include Indigenous peoples, local communities, government representatives, and UN representatives. We will share information and exchange views on Article 8J and related provisions. So what is Article 8J on traditional knowledge? What are the related provisions? And why these are important to Indigenous peoples and local communities. We will talk about the working group on Article 8J, what it is and why it's relevant. We will discuss what the post-2020 biodiversity framework means for Article 8J and related provisions, including what the post-2020 framework is and what it means for the work on Article 8J. We will also focus on enablers for the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the work of the CBD's post-2020 framework. And we will also discuss what it means to integrate the work of Article 8J into the work of CBD's subsidiary bodies post-2020. Lastly, we will exchange views on possible institutional arrangements, lessons learned, and pros and cons of current arrangements for Article 8J. Now this and much more will be addressed by our first speaker and co-moderator of today's webinar, Mr. John Scott. Now some logistics. For today's webinar, well, the webinar will be 2 hours long, and we will have an impressive group of speakers, as I mentioned before. The webinar will be divided into 2 sections, and each section will have 4 presentations, followed by a question and answer session. For the question and answer sessions, you may ask questions by writing them in the chat box in the control panel in your screens, or you can ask them by using your microphone. To do this, you must click on the hand in the control panel, and Diego will open your microphones. However, all attendees will be in listen mode only until we open your microphones. And for speakers, please ensure your microphones are muted when not speaking to reduce any background noise. Also very important to today's webinar, well, this will be complemented by an online discussion on the same topic. To join the discussion, please go to the Equator Connect website, Equator Connect. The address is www.connect.equatorinitiative.org. I repeat, www.connect.equatorinitiative.org. After the webinar, the CBD will also send a survey to all those people who registered for the webinar. We encourage you to fill out the survey as soon as possible. Now, today's contributions to the webinar discussion and your contributions to the online discussion, as well as your answers to the survey, will help inform the future work of the CBD on Article 8J and related provisions. and will contribute to the discussion of the ad hoc open-ended working group on Article 8J at its 11th meeting in late 2019 and the Conference of the Parties at its 15th meeting in 2020. For more information on the online forum and today's topic, please visit the CBD website. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. John Scott. As I said previously, he's today's co-moderator and our first speaker. John is an Indigenous descendant from Northeastern Australia, and he is Senior Program Officer for Traditional Knowledge and focal point for Indigenous peoples and local communities at the CBD Secretariat. We are very lucky to have him today. Over to you, John, and thank you very much to everyone.
Good morning, everyone. This is John Scott. I'm the Senior Program Officer for Traditional Knowledge, Innovations and Practices at the Convention on Biological Diversity and the focal point for Indigenous peoples and local communities. I'm very excited to be working with you all this morning to start a serious discussion on what should be the future work of relevance to Indigenous peoples and local communities in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a long-term plan from 2020 to 2050, with the vision of achieving living in harmony with nature by 2050. So this is a pivotal moment. The window of opportunity is between now and the working group in November, and perhaps also the subsidiary body on implementation and Substa, which will happen in May 2020. So this online discussion, and I'll take you through what I'd like to cover. Firstly, I'll touch on what are the obligations relating to traditional knowledge and Indigenous peoples and local communities under the CBD, the Nagoya Protocol, and the Cartagena Protocol. What is the current program of work on traditional knowledge? What are the achievements to date of the program of work? What are the current institutional arrangements on traditional knowledge under the CBD? And why is it important to mainstream traditional knowledge and issues related to Indigenous peoples and local communities into economic sectors? And for that, I have my colleague, Oliver Halil, who will support me with the issue of mainstreaming. Now, if I could talk a little bit about obligations relating to traditional knowledge under the CBD, we talk about Article 8J and related provisions. As I talk more about future work, I talk increasingly about work of relevance to Indigenous peoples and local communities, which I think is in line with parties' thinking and Indigenous people's thinking on what an integrated program of work might look like. So although we do have a cluster of articles, it's also interesting to think beyond the obligations of parties to how could we allow for the contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities more fully into the work of the CBD. Now, the articles directly related to Indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge is Article 8J, to respect, preserve and maintain the traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities, promote its wider application with the approval and involvement of the holders of such knowledge, which has been interpreted through various COP decisions as prior and informed consent, and also to encourage the equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of traditional knowledge. Now, other provisions are 10C, which focuses on rights to customary sustainable use, and then Articles 17, excuse me, 17 and 18, which talk to the repatriation of traditional knowledge and transfer of technologies, including innovations and practices of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Now, under the convention, we also have two legally binding protocols. We have the Nagoya Protocol, which builds on the access and benefit sharing provisions of the CBD to ensure a fair and equitable sharing arising from the use of genetic resources and traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. It was adopted in October 2010, entered into force 2014. It is now ratified by 116 parties to the CBD. And the CBD, of course, has 196 parties, including the European Union. The three pillars of the Nagoya Protocol are built on access, benefit sharing, and compliance. And it's legally binding for the parties to the Nagoya Protocol. Under the convention, we also have the Cartagena Protocol, which is an international treaty that seeks to protect biological diversity from the risks posed by living modified organisms, or LMOs, as we call them, often referred to as genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. So the Cartagena Protocol came into force in 2003 and has 171 parties. So obligations relating to Indigenous peoples, according to the current strategic plan, which ends in 2020, the mission is to take effective and urgent action to halt the loss of biodiversity in order to ensure that by 2020 ecosystems are resilient and continue to provide essential services, thereby securing the planet's variety of life and contributing to human well-being and poverty eradication. Of course, there's 20 Aceh targets. One that I'll focus on right now is target 18, and that is by 2020, the traditional knowledge innovations of Indigenous and local communities and their customer use are respected, if I can paraphrase. Now, the achievement of the Aceh target and the goals of the implementation of Article 8J and related provisions is through a program of work on traditional knowledge. The aim of the program of work is to promote within the framework of the convention a just implementation of Article 8J. And I think that that's an interesting expression in international law, a just implementation. So, of course, it was adopted almost 20 years ago in 2000, and it contains 5 elements and 17 tasks. So the time frame is to take us up to 2020. So our discussions today are asked to build on the achievements to date. So I want to quickly go over the achievements to date, and then we can move on to our discussion on what the future work should be, as well as possible institutional arrangements for the participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Now, the achievements to date is, of course, back in 2004, the Secretariat conducted an extensive report of all the world's socio-cultural regions, 7 regions identified by the Permanent Forum, and drafted a composite report on status and trends in traditional knowledge in each of the regions, which identified barriers and obstacles to the retention and use. Then it adopted a number of tools that are very useful for Indigenous peoples. The Tarawari Code of Ethical Conduct is adopted to ensure respect for the cultural and intellectual heritage of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and provides guidelines particularly to researchers working with such communities. The parties have also adopted by consensus the Aggregate Voluntary Guidelines, which are environmental impact assessment guidelines, which for the first time include cultural and social impacts with the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities affected. The parties have also adopted a plan of action on customary sustainable use of biological diversity, which recognises Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights to customary use of biological resources. At COP13, of course, the parties adopted the Moat Kutchal Voluntary Guidelines for Traditional Knowledge, and these are guidelines for national arrangements to provide that traditional knowledge is accessed with prior and informed consent, and its use is based on mutually agreed terms that guarantee an equitable sharing of benefits. So these guidelines were a culmination of many years of work, if they're effectively implemented, they can make a lot of difference on the ground for traditional knowledge. Also, at the COP14, the parties adopted the Ritso Yahiri Saksix voluntary guidelines for the repatriation of traditional knowledge. And this is to assist institutions in repatriating knowledge to help Indigenous peoples and local communities in knowledge restoration relevant for biodiversity. And finally, the parties adopted a glossary of relevant key terms and concepts to be used within the context of HA. Now, we have a couple of slides on pending tasks, and I won't read through these because we're running out of time, but I want to point out that the parties have, are requested to consider to what extent that these tasks have been addressed by completion of the other tasks. So certainly if they are worthy of further consideration, they could be proposed as future work if they're not considered to have been fully addressed. So there for your consideration, tasks 6, 11, 13, 14, and 17. Now I'm going to move straight on to participatory mechanisms for Indigenous peoples and local communities in the CBD. Of course, the Secretariat has 2 dedicated staff for Indigenous peoples and local communities. We work very closely with the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, which acts as an Indigenous corpus to the CBD. We also have a web presence, a traditional knowledge portal. The meeting that has been the focus for Indigenous peoples for almost 20 years has been the ad hoc open-ended working group on Article HA and related provisions, which meets every 2 years. The 11th meeting will be in November this year in Montreal. Indigenous peoples register as Indigenous peoples or local communities at our meetings, not as NGOs. We have a voluntary fund devoted to funding Indigenous peoples and local communities to participate. Because I really want us to have lots of time for discussion, and this is background. So of course, many people, Indigenous peoples that have joined us will remember that in the working group we have effective participation mechanisms almost on a level with government. It's a unique arrangement in the international system. The International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity nominates a Indigenous Bureau, which works with the Government Bureau in managing of the meeting and discusses difficult issues. We also have a government chair and an Indigenous chair to chair the working group, and Indigenous peoples and local communities are afforded additional opportunities to provide their views on different issues. So one of the discussions, of course, in the new arrangements is whether these mechanisms should flow into the other bodies, and would this be part of integration of Indigenous peoples and local communities across the work of the CBD? What would that look like in practice? So I'll stop there, and I'm going to hand very briefly to my colleague Oliver Hillel, who's going to talk a little bit about the importance of Indigenous peoples and local communities and traditional knowledge being used in mainstreaming efforts and what that means. So thank you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome and thank you to all of our participants. In the text of the convention itself, there is already a lot of strong mention to the need to integrate the concerns of biodiversity and ecosystem services into the mainstream of economics and politics and decision making. This is part of the proposal of sustainable use of biodiversity. But in the last 2 meetings of the conferences of the parties have examined specifically the biggest sectors, the biggest economic sectors affecting biodiversity. And they are, of course, agriculture, fisheries, and aquaculture, forestry, tourism, energy, of course, mining, infrastructure, health, and manufacture and processing. And maybe the sector that is not mentioned there, but that backstops all of them, is the finance and banking and insurance sector. So all of those together could, of course, use nature as its ultimate infrastructure. And that's what mainstreaming is all about. And I think, you know, the parties have created in the last conference an informal advisory group that will advise the Executive Secretary and the Bureau to develop what they call a long-term approach to mainstreaming for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So they are saying basically that all the economic sectors are very relevant to what happens in biodiversity and vice versa. And therefore, we need to have means for the productive sectors to engage with the convention. And I think that's a clear invitation to Indigenous people and local communities for many reasons. Two maybe more importantly. The first one is that we cannot go to any sustainability without the use and application of traditional knowledge into whatever this long-term approach to mainstreaming biodiversity will look like. It is important that this approach reflect and benefit and interact with the concerns and needs of Indigenous people and local communities. But of course, it is also hoped that the knowledge and the guidance and the material and information and best practices and guidelines that will arise out of this engagement with those sectors can also be used by Indigenous people and local communities in their local situations. So this is why I think it's very important that this group be advised of this informal advisory group, and that in general, that the mainstreaming efforts in the convention be supported. Traditional knowledge needs to be at the base of all production and consumption, not only in those, but in other sectors as well. And I think also in my experience, Indigenous people and local communities are champions in many, because they are producers as well. They are consumers as well. 50% of Indigenous people today live in cities. So this is absolutely something that touches Indigenous people and local communities. And so very important to conclude this is just the issue that, you know, whatever economic or financial mechanism or mainstreaming mechanism that the convention adopts, take into consideration the risks to Indigenous people and local communities in the planning and financing and you know, partnership developing phase. This is what we call the safeguard. So it's very important, that's the last point, that in you know, development agencies and banking and investment agents and policymakers be made aware of the need to include those safeguards into planning and financing, also for the, of course, the full participation and involvement of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Thank you very much, and I'll be available for questions.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you to both of you for sharing more on the program of work on Article 8J, the importance of mainstreaming of biodiversity into the various productive sectors, and bringing up the idea of the safeguards, especially for a lot of the financing for projects and development. So thank you both. We will move to our next speaker, and this is Ms. Georgie Carino. She's Senior Policy Advisor for the Forest Peoples Program. Georgie, you have the floor.
I'm going to discuss how Indigenous peoples and local communities can help transform CBD implementation towards the 2050 vision. And primarily, I'll be looking at the lessons we've learned from local biodiversity outlooks. So I'm Georgie Carino. I'm Ibaloy Igorot from the Cordillera, Philippines. And recently, I've focused a lot of my work on community-based monitoring and information systems as tools for governance for the communities themselves, but also in order to interface with national governments and the global processes, especially in relation to the implementation of global commitments. I help coordinate the International Expert Seminar on Indicators Relevant for Indigenous Peoples. and recently was co-editor of Local Biodiversity Outlooks. Now, Local Biodiversity Outlooks was written up by indigenous and local community authors, and this was meant to complement GBO4, because when GBO4 came out, we said, why don't we complement this with lots of stories from the ground? And so this was launched at COP13, and it was welcomed by the parties. And because of that, we are now in the process of developing the second edition called LBO2. So now I'll concentrate on some of the key findings we found from Local Biodiversity Outlooks. First, we saw that the collective actions of indigenous peoples and local communities are already advancing the implementation of the strategic plan and all 20 biodiversity targets. So it's not just target 18, in fact, that is cross-cutting, and it's important that we see the contributions across the 20 targets. And now the evidence is really growing that indigenous IPLC lands hold much of the world's biodiversity, and supporting our actions can be one of the most effective ways to promote biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And because of this, IPLCs are really not just observers, we are permanent partners of the convention, because we will continue to be living on our lands, and we will continue to be guardians of biodiversity. And clearly, this very close linkage between biological and cultural diversity is what is helping to increase the resilience to social, environmental, and climate change. So we now understand that social and ecological systems work very closely together. Therefore, because of this, we need to mainstream across the entire global agenda. Okay, if we look at the global landscape, pretty much policy in climate, sustainable development, and biodiversity understand the value of traditional knowledge. However, that recognition in policy really needs to be implemented, primarily through partnerships, because this is where we need to be going, because we need to be putting our stress on implementation. And when we move towards implementation, it is actually the customary land tenure and traditional occupations, and also securing the human rights of indigenous peoples, that will also secure the contributions we are making to ecosystem resilience and also climate benefits. Indigenous peoples are disproportionately among those who are being killed for being land and environmental defenders. So governments also have to step up their obligations on human rights and really protect those who are currently under threat. And then finally, in order to fully see the contributions which are being made, we are putting now a big stress on community-based monitoring as a complement to national reporting, and also to be a check on the accountability if governments and other actors are really carrying out the obligations. And we are building the evidence base for what is actually happening on the ground, and we will be reporting this through local biodiversity outlooks. So what will be the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, clearly biodiversity underpins the realization of the SDGs. And I think the CBD in particular has already shown the close relationship between biodiversity and traditional knowledge. Therefore, securing the SDGs will also mean securing the rights of indigenous peoples, particularly to our lands and to biodiversity itself. In fact, the SDGs, 92% of the SDG targets are directly linked to human rights. Therefore, taking a human rights-based approach will be very important in the SDG implementation. And here, we need to monitor how well we are doing, both in the strategic plan of the CBD. Yes, so we need to have a holistic approach also in our monitoring. And we are trying to do this through various tools. For example, the tool of the Indigenous Navigator, which monitors both the UN Declaration, biodiversity, and also the SDGs. And here in particular, I want to draw attention to the indicators on land tenure, which are linked to Goal 1 on ending poverty, Goal 2 on ending hunger, and Goal 5 on gender equality. This is the land indicator on secure land tenure, including collective land tenure, but also including the tenure of women. So this really has to be one of the central areas where we need to make movement on the SDGs and thus also secure biodiversity. So finally, I'd like to show some virtuous circles for the post-2020 framework. First, the harmonization of global commitments in the national and local implementation. And that means exactly mainstreaming biodiversity into the various sectors in the global agenda. Next, cultural and biological diversity interlinkages. Post-2020 needs to look at the links between nature and culture and treat this as a complex integrated system. Learning from diverse knowledge systems, any future structure should build in a learning platform where indigenous peoples and local communities, for example, our traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices can be fully integrated, and we can advise on how to do that and bring it to actual implementation. And I think this will require a permanent body in the CBD where we will be full partners. So in terms of governance from the CBD, realizing this will need a permanent body where we are more fully actors in both in the advisory element, but also much more fully in the implementation. So based on that, I have a question for everyone. So in addition to the lessons I've highlighted from local biodiversity outlooks, based on your own experience, how can ITLCs transform CBD implementation towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature? So I hope that the presentation was useful. I'm looking forward to our discussions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Georgie, for this wonderful presentation, for bringing to everybody's attention the importance of the local biodiversity outlook, its key findings, the importance of partnerships, consistency, evidence-based monitoring, and of course, reminding us of the linkages between nature and culture. So we're changing our program a little bit. We will go directly to Ms. Malta Kwatikana, who is Senior Policy Advisor for the Department of Environmental Affairs of South Africa. And after her presentation, we will go back to Ms. Lucy Molenke. Malta, can you hear me?
Hello.
Hi, Malta, we can hear you. Thank you so much. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. My talk will be on the incorporation of Article 8J and provisions related to indigenous peoples and local communities in the work of the convention and its protocols. My brief introduction, my name is Malta Kwatikana at the CBD National Focal Point for South Africa. I work for the Department of Environmental Affairs in South Africa as a Senior Policy Advisor, International Advisor Services, and I am responsible for coordinating and management of biodiversity-related multilateral environmental agreements and facilitate their implementation at the national level. The first question I was going to address it is important to mention that South Africa has submitted views in this regard, which are contained in document CBD Corp 14 in 5 Rev 1. And the next slide is on based on the first question, which is saying based on your experience and traditional knowledge and indigenous peoples and local communities, IPLCs, is saying share some views regarding the future work of on TK within the CBD and its protocols. So I was saying the objective that we selected that we will dwell on is more about developing or creating regulatory mechanisms, which can be standards or guidelines for the protection, promotion, development, and management of indigenous or traditional knowledge systems with a full and effective participation of IPLCs. So my discussion would be all coiling around the importance of developing policies or regulatory mechanisms to ensure the adequate protection, the adequate promotion, the adequate development and management of indigenous or traditional knowledge systems within, with the full participation of the knowledge holders. This we say is because we want a system that must facilitate the development of sui generis system as per decision 16 of COP 7H on the elements to be considered in the development of sui generis systems of protecting or protection for indigenous or traditional knowledge, taking into consideration the customary laws, values, and worldviews. Most importantly, it is also, adjust my screen, the legal framework must recognize the communal characteristics of indigenous or traditional knowledge. The reason why we would like to have this strong regulatory mechanism is because we want this to consider also guidelines for the documentation and the recording of indigenous or traditional knowledge. The development of implementing processes to facilitate collection, documentation, storage, and dissemination of uncaptured indigenous knowledge on an active and continuous basis through indigenous knowledge systems documentation centers. As I indicated earlier, this all relies on a very strong regulatory mechanism to ensure the protection of the rights of the knowledge holders. We also want to ensure that the development of guidelines to provide material and non-material support mechanisms and incentives to indigenous peoples and local communities for capacity building initiatives towards promotion of indigenous knowledge, innovations and practices, institutional strengthening and negotiating capacity. Furthermore, material and non-material incentives for maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. We also would like to see that these guidelines, there are guidelines that are established to establish mechanisms with an international scope for the application and implementation of Article 8J of the CBD and other articles related to the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. Also of importance to us is building mechanisms for community-based biocultural protocol development and a platform, develop a platform to engage in dialogue with external stakeholders so that communities could engage constructively under their own terms and priorities. We also look at the development of an instrument that sets out clear guidelines in engaging communities. If you can look at the statements that we are making, it's more about a regulated mechanism, as I said before, to ensure that these happen in an appropriate and a very structured manner. Also, we were looking at regulating the repatriation of indigenous knowledge associated with genetic resources held in ex situ databases or registers. If I can touch on the RSA experience, our experience in South Africa, for example, our current focus of attention is on the development of the national recordal system with the primary intention of documenting and recording oral knowledge. The recordal system will secure the rights to knowledge when communities, guilds, and other indigenous knowledge holders knowledge who can record their knowledge, holdings and lifestyles sequentially to assist their interest in the future knowledge economy, educational and economic benefits and social good based on indigenous knowledge. The issues are also on capacity building as well as accreditation and certification. The next question is, how is this objective important? This objective will address the illegal use, misappropriation of IK or TK, including illegal accreditation and certification. Also, the selective involvement will come to an end because people will be more actively trained for engagement. Will be trained for more active engagement. The record and identification of holders of IK and TK and securing of the rights to the knowledge. That will be the importance of this objective. And what will be the outcomes? The outcomes will be the protection of IK and TK from illegal usages, misappropriation, including illegal accreditation and certification. And the full and effective participation of the IPLECs will be improved in the protection of rights, as well as the regulatory mechanism that will provide for access to IK and TK and conditions for such access. The questions that I will ask the rest of the participants is, when we do all this regulation of activities related to indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, how would we ensure the protection of such knowledge from new developments, emerging issues such as digital sequence information usage? And also, how would we ensure that the indigenous peoples and local communities are effectively and actively involved in issues, new emerging issues or new emerging technologies, such as the engineered gene drives, for their effective participation, as well as how would they meaningfully engage to such new developments in technology. The rest of the slides, colleagues, will be the information on what we have done in South Africa, the policies that we have developed, the guidelines and bills and all those things. And then it's for your information to read in your own time because it touches on the issues that I've touched on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martha, for your presentation. And we apologize for not having enough time for you to share all of this really interesting material in the National Recordal System. But to all the attendees, we will be sharing this material on our online site on Equator Connect. And we will also be providing the recording to today's webinar and all the presentations. So do not worry, you will have access to all of this material as soon as the webinar concludes. So unfortunately, our colleague Lucy Mulenkes has been having some technical problems. So we would like to proceed with the question and answer segment of this part of the webinar. And as we mentioned previously, please raise your hands on your screens or type some of your questions in the chat box. Given that our time is quite limited as well today, I promise all of you that if any questions remain unanswered, we will deliver them to the presenters and ensure you get a response to your question. So we would like to start with some of the questions we have, some of the hands raised. If we could start with Mary Christri Baleva.
Yeah. So hi.
Hi, Suda. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. So the session was really very good. So
yes,
I just have a question regarding the protection of the traditional knowledge. Because you know, we're in a country like India, we have got lots of traditional knowledge across the country, and you know, like it's being very difficult for us to collect all these and also to like assemble them as a database and to check, you know, to protect all this knowledge and because we find a lot of corporates getting involved in it, and the rights is not being really going to those traditional people who are involved in it. So what can be the best methodology we can ensure to protect this knowledge collected from them?
Great, thank you very much, Sudha, for your question. We're going to take a couple of more in the interest of time, so we'll take a couple from the chat box and a couple of raised hands. Could we go with Mary Christopher? Have you been able to unmute your microphone?
Yes, I have.
Hi, Mary. Yes, we can.
Good evening from Asia. I just want to ask, how can regional mechanisms like the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity contribute to the discourse and the integration of these provisions on indigenous rights and to the implementation or the operationalization of these rights? Thank you.
In the meantime, I'm going to read a couple of questions. We have one on the chat box from Elena Makeva. So, hi, John. It is nice to hear about great achievements during 20 years time frame. I just wanted to take attention to countries, CEE region, for example, having TK, but have no real tools and legal mechanisms to for access to them. Did you include in your plan of activities holding workshops on the matters in the CEE region? Warm regards, Elena. And then we have another question from Robert Gibson. I was wondering how local food insecurity can be addressed with greater use of traditional knowledge. And I'll go with a third question from the chat from Oindirila Basu. I would like to know if use of vernacular language can serve as a good medium to share science to indigenous peoples and monitoring. So colleagues, given that we're a little behind on time, we will go with these questions and then get back to all of you a little bit later or during the second question and answer session. Thank you. John, would you like to start with any thoughts about these questions?
Thank you, Eva. It's John Scott here, the Senior Program Officer for Traditional Knowledge. Thank you for all of those questions. Sujata, you raised the question about how do we adequately protect traditional knowledge, particularly traditional knowledge used by corporate interests beyond national borders. So far, the tools and guidelines developed through the working group process and adopted by the parties have focused on voluntary guidelines and principles. They're negotiated and adopted by consensus. Therefore, I would argue that they become minimal standards in international customary law. However, the parties have not addressed the issue of an international framework for traditional knowledge. This is the prerogative of the 196 parties of the convention. And of course, there's been some reluctance while the WIPO intergovernmental process on traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions and genetic resources continues. I think that was an interesting question. Certainly, if that's the way that governments want to go, this is the time to make proposals for exciting new work in the global post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Also, the workshops, Elena from the CEC region, thank you for those questions. Of course, with when we talked about the achievements of HA to date, we have a whole toolkit full of principles and guidelines that parties can get on with using at home and take measures for traditional knowledge. Of course, a lot can be achieved through capacity building, but given the next 20-month period and the development of the post-2020 arrangements, the Secretariat will certainly be more focused on the development. All our resources will be focused on the 2020 process at this stage. But certainly, and something that's being recommended as future work is the parties implement and report on implementing the many guidelines and tools that have been negotiated and adopted over the years related to traditional knowledge and Indigenous peoples. I just want to hand to my colleague Oliver, who wanted to make a comment on the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity. Please go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to make a quick response to that because, for instance, I do know that the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity has nominated a participant to the informal advisory group on mainstreaming. So I was going to mention that right there is an opportunity for the center to contribute and represent the perspectives and needs of Indigenous people and local communities, because, as I said, there is a need for a stronger contribution of traditional knowledge to mainstreaming. And that partially also, John, replies to the concern about food security. You know, many of the larger cities in the world are considering ways and means for urban and peri-urban biodiversity to help them on the tremendously relevant issue of food security in urban centers. And the issue is that with more than 50% of Indigenous people and local communities today living in cities, that knowledge is essential for those cities to find ways towards food security with the use of traditional knowledge.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, both of you, for your response. I just want to share a comment from one of our attendees that says, in Rwanda, we have developed a guideline on accessing traditional knowledge in the framework of the Nagoya Protocol, one of the tools that helps in considering TK in our regulations. So Joji and Malta, if you would like to respond to any of the questions. And Georgie, we also received a question from Daniel Kobe that might be of interest to you. How can we link the issue of poverty while addressing biodiversity to SDGs? And we have done a lot in Article 8J. How can we ensure that programs and projects are being mainstreamed to IPOCs? So this is also of interest to Malta. So if Georgie, Malta, we could get some short thoughts on any of the questions that have been asked by our attendees.
Yes, very briefly. I think the regional space will be extremely important because here governments are not thinking on global terms. They're thinking about how they can get down to implementation, and they're also concretely identifying problems and challenges. And if, for example, indigenous peoples and local communities became part of, for example, the ASEAN processes, then we can really get down to discussion of partnerships and how to go forward. And because of the holistic approach, governments are also harmonizing their various strategies and action plans. So definitely the linkage to the SDGs and climate should also become part of the overall discussions. I think governments appreciate that. And certainly among indigenous peoples, we always want a holistic approach because we don't want to be chopping up all of our various engagements.
Great, thank you so much, Georgie, for your response. Malta, would you have any thoughts on the questions that were raised by some of our attendees based on your experience in South Africa?
Yes, there was a question about collection of indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge and
Yes.
the best methodology that can be used. And the comment I can make is that collecting and documenting traditional knowledge is a very sensitive issue in the sense that if there is no adequate regulatory mechanism for certification and accreditation, then collection of traditional knowledge can be subjected to illegal usages and misappropriation. And hence, strengthening national laws first and national regulatory mechanism is the best way to go before any collection and documentation of traditional knowledge is embarked on. On the best methodology to be used, I can say it can be a national, it's a case-by-case situation. It depends. There are guidelines that have been mentioned, for instance, by John, many guidelines that have been developed, and the regulatory mechanisms we have spoken about in South Africa and guidelines. All those need to be considered and packaged to suit national priorities because we can share our experience and it suits the other nationality. Everybody has got different circumstances. Maybe developing guidelines as a country is the best starting point, and having strong regulatory mechanism to ensure that there is no misappropriation of the information that is being collected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mata, for your response. And thank you all of our attendees for fruitful discussion and facilitation. So as I was saying, I see that there are still around 7 hands that have been raised. If your questions are to specific speakers from this morning, you can also send them via the chat and we will add them to the online forum discussion and we will provide a response to all of you. So apologies for the lack of time to continue with this very interesting and fruitful discussion. So we will proceed to the second part of today's webinar. And our next speaker is Ms. Danica Littlechild from the Cree Nation and co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts under Pathway to Canada Target 1.
Tansa Toya Kakio, Kananoskam Tenual Ota Pentumiak. My name is Danica Littlechild. I'm from the Musqueam Cree in Treaty Number 6 in Canada. And I'm going to speak to you today about some bigger ideas. My presentation will be much less focused on a detailed set of recommendations, but rather be a broader discussion about some of what I see as some central hurdles and issues that we have to understand and discuss together. So a bit about me. My involvement in this field of work was expanded recently when I took on the role of co-chairing a body called the Indigenous Circle of Experts. And so, as you are all, I'm sure, familiar with the Aichi targets, Canada, as a party to the CBD, adopted a number of targets, and they made their target 1 Aichi target 11. So this is the target to increase protected and conserved areas to 17% by 2020 of all land mass. And so the Pathway to Canada Target 1 was a sort of initiative inaugurated by the federal government along with the government of Alberta, which is the province in which I live. And the idea was to establish a number of advisory bodies for the co-lead ministers to allow for them to determine what practically had to be done to meet Aichi Target 11 in the context of Canada. And so the Indigenous Circle of Experts was sort of the Indigenous arm of a number of advisory bodies. What you see on the right of your screen is the screenshot of the cover page of our final report and advice to the co-lead ministers, which you can download online and which I will certainly send on to the organizers of this webinar so that they can distribute also in PDF form. That work really focused on the articulation and description of what was possible around bolstering Indigenous protected and conserved areas in Canada, and in fact creating a new designation of protection and conservation in Canada. In addition to my work under the Pathway to Canada Target 1, I've also been facilitating an Indigenous advisory circle for Canada's first national park established in the 1800s called Banff National Park, which many may be familiar with. I'm also consulting legal counsel for International Indian Treaty Council, an NGO with consultative status at the UN. We work with Indigenous peoples from the Americas, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And I recently concluded a number of years of work with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and as such, I'm very intimately familiar with UNESCO designations of protections. So what do I think about future work? So one of the biggest issues that I think we continue to face, and I will say this because of my experience under the Pathway process in Canada, is that in spite of the fact that we have some wonderful standards that John Scott outlined, some great accomplishments internationally, the translation of these standards to real life on the ground progress remains challenging for, I think, a number of reasons. And so, so how do we continue to create space for Indigenous peoples to lead the way, as opposed to Indigenous peoples being told, here's the framework for you, figure out how you fit into it. One of the things that I've noticed about sort of our standard setting processes in general within the United Nations system is that because we are Indigenous peoples within a non-Indigenous framework, being the United Nations in general, I'm speaking large terms here, Indigenous peoples have often, in many, many forums, tried to define themselves using the language and descriptors and definitions offered to them by that system, which was not written by or for them. So many may know that we weren't actually even allowed to go to the United Nations to the grounds until 1977. And we didn't have the UN Declaration until many decades later in 2007. And part of what I've seen as a trend is that in an effort to make ourselves understood within a system that is having some great difficulty either understanding us or respecting us, there's a lot of discrimination that continues today. Many may know that even the discussion of TK, of traditional knowledge, has been met with a lot of resistance, even from scientists. Scientists believe that it undermines science. And so in an effort to make ourselves understood in this larger mainstream system, we often spend a lot of time trying to define ourselves for people. And what I suggest is that we stop trying to do that. I think that for me, future work that is going to be of great value is if Indigenous systems are simply allowed and left alone to function, and that we instead focus our efforts on how we communicate between systems. So what is the appropriate framework that must exist for Indigenous systems to function in a relation to mainstream systems. And by mainstream systems, I mean United Nations, I mean state parties, national laws. How do we create space for an ethical and an appropriate interaction? What does that space look like? So to my mind, I really resist the idea of continuing to try to define or do standard setting on what TK is. I think that's a hamster wheel. I think what we need to do is recognize that we will never get to a final definition or a beautiful document that will summarize everything for us all over the world. It's never going to happen. What we need to do is focus on processes and procedures that allow for those hugely diverse holders of different knowledge systems representing whole systems. You know, these are not just little pieces of information, whole systems. How do we make sure that they can function in the way that they were intended to? And I think for me, a big priority has to be safeguards. A big priority has to be complaints, grievance, redress for appropriations. And a big area must be having the appropriate recognition of those representatives themselves so that they have the kind of advocacy and place that they deserve. Why is this important right now? As I mentioned, let's get past being prescriptive. And by being prescriptive, what that means is telling Indigenous peoples, okay, here's what you can do to protect your knowledge. Indigenous peoples know how to manage their own knowledge. They are experts of their knowledge. And I think that that's another trap that we've sort of walked into at times, is that we have allowed sometimes non-Indigenous peoples to come and tell us what's best for us in terms of how we think about ourselves. And we've done that in developed places like Canada as well. A lot of the court claims that we have about our resources, our lands, over the years, we've always had to call on non-Indigenous experts about Indigenous peoples who talk about anthropological evidence, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, Indigenous systems and knowledge and ties to those lands and resources are not recognized in equality, in equity to those mainstream knowledge systems. And so that's, to me, the big hurdle here, is that even though we talk about protection, lifting up Indigenous systems, I don't think we're there yet, especially when you look at a place like Canada, where a lot of people perceive things to be really progressive. We actually have an incredibly difficult time getting Indigenous knowledge systems to truly be recognized and lifted up and elevated. And so we have to be able to have the space to implement our own high standards of protection, conservation, exercise our own systems. And so that's really my message. And I think—
Danica, sorry to interrupt, this is Eva, but you have 1 to 2 minutes left for your presentation.
Yep. I only have a few slides. And so I think part of the other aspect of it is that I don't want to see future work to require Indigenous peoples to make themselves small in order to have a place at the table. I think we need to create expansive spaces for Indigenous peoples. So we have to think about moving away from what has been status quo to thinking about real systems change. And what does that mean in the context of CBD? Well, it may mean that even we as Indigenous peoples have to reconsider what we think of as inclusion, because we're so used to trying to fit within their narrative that I think we need to change our own approaches. The other thing is that I haven't really seen very strongly articulated is that actually the UN Declaration creates obligations for the CBD and the states parties to significantly change the way they approach things. And I don't see that strongly enough emerging. And we have to start being critical thinkers about the way these systems are functioning and start questioning a little bit more and pushing a little bit more I know a lot of people think incremental change is good, but I think we're really in a moment where we could see a real systems shift if we very much focused on it. And I think that there's nowhere more possible than CBD. We also need to understand that.
Danica, just one minute left, so we can move on to Pernilla. Apologies for interrupting you.
Okay. I lost my thought. Okay, so we need to understand how different ethical and legal protections offered by Indigenous systems can change the narrative. And we need to bolster support for Indigenous knowledge as opposed to seeing Indigenous knowledge as these little tidbits of information that support science. And I think that's really about flipping that coin. I would challenge the audience to say, are you truly making space for Indigenous peoples, or are you following a status quo narrative that has been prescribed and used within the CBD over the decades that it's been in existence? How can we flip that? How can we push that so that Indigenous peoples are not these passive beneficiaries or occasional contributors, but are true partners and recognized as such?
Thank you so much, Danica, for this fantastic presentation, for providing us with more information on the pathway to Canada and Target 1, Indigenous protected and conserved areas, about focusing on how to communicate within systems, importance of safeguards, complaints, redress mechanisms, but then very importantly, how to move away from prescriptive mechanisms and the status quo, and to think a little bit more what it means to be Indigenous in this larger system of systems. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Pernilla Malmer from SwedBio at the Stockholm Resilience Center. Pernilla, over to you. And colleagues, again, if you have any questions for our new sets of speakers, Danica, Pernilla, Lifuraha, and Marina, please start sending them via the chat or start raising your hands, and we will get to them as soon as our presenters have had an opportunity to share their presentation. Thank you. Pernilla, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. I was asked to bring up one element for the post-2020 program of work on traditional knowledge. But there are so many opportunities for that, what we can do under this new program. So I negotiated to bring up two elements. These two are firstly, a comprehensive safeguard framework covering the diversity of areas in the Convention's engagement with people and nature, aiming at win-win solutions for freeing biodiversity and people. And secondly, the important achievements that can be brought by intercultural learning across Indigenous, local, and scientific knowledge system for the sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity. So in the background pictures that we will be following in this presentation illustrate such learning opportunity. They are from a walking workshop and dialogue across knowledge system a few weeks ago in the Karen community of Finland in Thailand. It was co-convened by SwedBio in collaboration with UNESCO, and the two centers of distinction on Indigenous and local knowledge past an impact that are local and national Karen Indigenous organizations in Thailand. During this dialogue, the key messages for policymakers of the IPBS pollinator assessment was jointly revisited and analyzed by knowledge holders and scientists that contributed to assessment together. And these kind of dialogues are an example of the energy and creativity in meeting across knowledge system, as well as the need for safeguards in support of conservation and sustainable use, such as for the Karen people and their rotational farming systems, and safe spaces for interaction across knowledge systems. So my name is Pernilla Malmer. I am an agronomist and I work at Stockholm Resilience Center, that is a transdisciplinary research center for sustainability science. I am working on a program called SwedeBio that is funded by the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. SwedeBio is a knowledge interface between practice, policy, and science. I work specifically on biodiversity, rights, and resilient livelihoods, from local reality to global policy. And I have been engaged in the CBD and the important support of customer sustainable use of indigenous peoples and local community and traditional knowledge, at least for a decade. I'm also technical expert on these areas in the Swedish delegation at CBD meetings. So with regards of the elements then, safeguard for thriving indigenous people and healthy ecosystem is an area where the ongoing program of work on traditional knowledge has already done a lot of great work, such as earlier mentioned here, the Moscow guidelines on traditional knowledge that recognize free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous knowledges, and the Secretariat Code of Ethical Conduct that points out important standards for working with indigenous peoples and local communities and projects in the territories. Further, it recognizes that respect for traditional knowledge requires that it is valued equally with and complementary to scientific knowledge. And the most important, CBD has also, under the negotiation for resource mobilization, been encouraging a process for building safeguard in biodiversity finance mechanism. This has been evolving since COP11 in 2012 and engaged many actors, both in parties and indigenous peoples and local communities and donors, etc. The latest decision from COP14 did also foresee safeguard as an area that needs continued commitment post-2020 in a fully integrated work stream on traditional knowledge and indigenous peoples and local communities engagement. That element is envisioned to address gaps, but in particular find ways to implementation. So just for some proposal of task for the safeguards. Operationalization of the already agreed safeguard under the CBD and ensure they are implemented and included at national and local level is critical. This has to be country-driven in participatory processes where everybody can be included from local level where projects are happening. And that led us to the next task, that is to create fora for lessons learned and joint action between ongoing processes for the operationalization of the CBD safeguard agreed upon. And this is then also to engage in dialogue with other conventions, as well as the Human Rights Council and UN Permanent Forum, etc., on the co-development of strategies to implement legal instruments relevant for integrated approaches that create win-win for people and biodiversity. With regards of task for knowledge collaboration and equity across knowledge systems, the IPBS, that is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, are doing a great job in developing methods and ways of working with synergies across knowledge systems based on equity and reciprocity and usefulness for all involved. The walking workshop that we are following in these background pictures is a great example of how these methods can work. These methods could be scaled up and mainstream in all kinds of work related to the CBD, and in particular the implementation. Thus, second task is to promote a sustained dialogue between science and indigenous and local knowledge or traditional knowledge, as we call it in CBD, in order to generate the best possible solution for biological and cultural resilience when we are trying to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. Thirdly, to promote intercultural awareness training for scientists and others working with indigenous peoples and local communities. The last 2 points I have brought in from the declaration of the Nature and Culture Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh in November 2018. So my question to you then is how we can encourage solid safeguards for freeing indigenous people and local community and healthy ecosystem to be systematically applied at all levels in the convention, and of course further in the SDGs. And this would really be to the benefit of nature and people, and ensuring we take advantage of all possible synergy there are at hand, and that we have elaborated in many of these good guidelines that have been developed so far. So thank you for this, and looking forward for questions and more presentations.
Thank you so much, Pernilla, for your presentation, for sharing the outputs of the meetings across knowledge systems in Thailand, reiterating the importance of safeguards, of operationalizing the safeguards linked to international legislations, the importance of exchanges across knowledge systems, intercultural training, and of course reminding us of the work that a lot of the colleagues that are attending this webinar undertook in Sharm el-Sheikh with that declaration. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Elifuraha Laltaika. He is a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from Tanzania. Mr. Elifuraha, you have the floor.
So, hi everybody, my name is Elifuraha Laltaika. I'm an expert member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and I'm going to address the integration of Article 8J and the provisions related to indigenous peoples and local communities in the wake of the convention and its protocols. And I will on behalf of the forum, really look at key issues that we think should underpin this work from 2020 going forward. So a little bit about myself. As I've said, I'm a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and as most of you may know, this is a high-level expert body working closely with the UN ECOSOC, which has a wide-ranging mandate, including to advise the UN, its programs, including the World Bank, on how to implement the declaration. And I also work in Tanzania as a law lecturer, where I teach international law, human rights law, as well as environmental law. But probably also relevant to this discussion is that a decade ago I co-founded the Association for Law and the Advocacy for Pastoralists. This is an indigenous people's NGO based in Arusha, Tanzania, which among other things look at the environmental issues, human rights, and how indigenous peoples who are custodians of biodiversity would access and benefit from the rich biodiversity. But very quickly, if I look based on my experience and traditional knowledge, what would be the future work? I think on behalf of the Permanent Forum, the forum welcomes the idea of having a permanent body with a specific mandate of addressing issues relating to indigenous peoples and local communities. So as very well said, and this has been very well documented from various works of the UN CBD as communicated, it's important really to have a forum that specifically, links and make a follow-up on indigenous people's specific concerns. But most importantly, the forum is of the view, and I think other panelists have mentioned this, that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provides the foundation for Indigenous peoples' aspirations in a wide waterfront of issues, including traditional knowledge. So I think from 2020 going forward, we think the role and contents of the declaration should be highlighted even further, because it's a very comprehensive international law that really may provide some signposts whenever we think that we are probably stuck a little bit in our conceptualization of issues. And this probably I'll mention again towards the end of my presentation, we think issues of representation of Indigenous peoples in the would-be new body should be at the center of all discussions, because we need the gains to be upscaled and really not to lose out whenever we are making some changes. I don't know how to go to the second slide. I'm stuck a little bit. Yes, okay. This is probably an elephant in the room, but we also think as a forum that there's a need to clarify the distinctions and the implications of the distinction between Indigenous peoples and local communities. And this is probably also connected to issues of the distinctions in terms of land rights and self-determination and probably representation. So it's very important to probably commission a study that will bring to light the implications and the legal aspects surrounding, this nomenclature. I think it's also important during 2020 to highlight this a little bit. But issues of traditional institutions that have also been highlighted deserve special attention, as well as traditional resilience that are embedded in Indigenous people's cultures. And as I said, this can be done through many ways, but the UN Permanent Forum recommends commissioning a study that comes up with a position paper that highlights legal and institutional implications of the aspects I've mentioned above. Another aspect is keeping an eye and putting more emphasis on the implementation of the guidelines and principles relating to the work of Article J at the country level. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, I think this is where the rubber hits the road. So we really think it's important to put a lot of efforts in seeing these very, very important principles being implemented on the ground, especially at the country level. Otherwise, we can have very colorful principles, but we don't have some legal mechanisms, and probably also goodwill on the part of state parties to implement and therefore benefit Indigenous peoples. Issues of customary sustainable use of biological resources. This is very, very well put in the minutes, but the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is also concerned that probably hunter-gatherers whose lives are intrinsically dependent on their sustainable use of biological resources should also be highlighted more from 2020 going forward. And there's no time to delve in details on this, but we think given their vulnerabilities and the multiple effects caused by impacts of climate change, it's important to detach some of decisions from country level and probably discuss their plight at the international level. Issues of overlaps between science.
Sorry to interrupt you, but you have 2 minutes left maximum.
Exactly. I can see I have a few more seconds, but I'm in the last slide, so I think I'm okay. Yes, so issues of science and indigenous knowledge, the overlaps, I think we have seen other UN agencies doing a great job in these regards, and it's important to upscale in connection to climate resilience practices among indigenous peoples. And lastly, a question that is relevant for all of us to look into is how can indigenous peoples build on the gains made in the last few years, especially in connection to the work of the CBD, and ensure that their effective representation in the processes is not undermined, but is actually improved. With that, thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Ali Furaha, for your presentation and for reminding us of the importance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Of course, noting that there are distinctions between IPOCs, especially when it comes to all sorts of land rights and resource rights. The importance of highlighting hunter-gatherers in the post-2020 framework, and the role that IPOCs play in climate resilience, so upscaling this and the recognition that it deserves. With that, I would like to give the floor to our last speaker, and this is Ms. Marina von Weissenberg. She is Senior Advisor at the Ministry of Environment in Finland. So Marina, thank you for joining us today. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening from Finland. And all, of course, all 100 attendees as well. It's a lot of wisdom and good experiences have already been shared here, and I'm the last one. And I also would like to thank the CBD Secretariat for preparing the Article 8J background document, OM/1/2, and also for providing us with the CBD 14-in-5 document, Rev 1, which I think are very important one. I also would like to look at the broader issue here on the possible institutional arrangements, including lessons learned and pros and cons of current arrangement. Noting the time frame I have, this is a huge task, but some ideas I have been putting on the table. My name is Marina von Weissenberg. I'm a Senior Ministerial Advisor at the Ministry of the Environment. I'm a political scientist. I'm the CBD National Focal Point for Finland, and also the CBD Substa National Focal Point for the same country. I have a long experience of this convention. I have been working around these issues and the CBD since 93, in fact, but since 95 I have been the national focal point. But I don't want to talk too much about myself. Here is a picture of myself together with Chantal. We are in Montreal, and we are working on synergies between the biodiversity-related convention, a passion I have, and also some experiences of being the vice president for IUCN 2012 to 2016, and 8 years in the IUCN Council. Here is the Finnish Sami Parliament of Finland. I don't have any background of being myself an indigenous person, but having a connection with the Sami Parliament and working through our national Article 8J working group, which we have had quite for a long time already. Here we see Tiina Saanila-Aikio in the middle. She is the chair of the Sami Parliament, and they will have their elections later this spring for electing their own parliament. Again, this is a very important parliament, and also in the constitution, the work what they are doing. This is only to give a flavor of the indigenous people of Finland. This is the area where the Samis live, and this is only a picture of having the flavor of the areas I'm coming from. So we have an issue here on the future work. First of all, I would like to say that the program of work for Article 8J, I think that has had a great both the provisions and the work that has been done. At least I appreciate that a lot. I think it's one of the working programs that has had success in the CBD. Of course, there are, as mentioned already by John Scott, we still have tasks that has not been fulfilled, but I think that those tasks as well and the guidelines, plenty of them has been mentioned today. ACVECON and the other ones are really important, and I think we should use them in formulating and integrating those in the target setting for post 2020, of course. The Article 8J, there are issues with the future work. I think there are 2 or 3 options. And of course, in the background documents that we have got, we see that there are, first of all, that the Article 8J should be, of course, a prominent part of the existing subsidiary body of implementation, including the CBD and its protocols. And especially regarding the protocols on Nagoya and Cartagena, including the new issues on digital sequence information and synthetic biology. I think these are really interesting new pathways, and I think here also the issue of Article 8J has a very important role to play in the future. So there are issues that we could have Article 8J issues integrated in the SBI and separate possible working group. And then I think I would like to stress the regional broad-based consultations in the future because of both language issues, but also the cultural issues, and also because of having a stronger push. I think the regional broad-based consultations are really important, and one of the issues that I think we would need to support. Then, of course, personally, which the whole talk here is my personal issues in this issue, not the Finnish official government position, is that a new permanent body and open-ended, such as a subsidiary advisory body to Article 8J to the CBD. I think that's also coming from the background documents. It's something that instead of having the ad hoc open-ended working group like now, I think in the post-2020 framework, we should have a subsidiary body on Article 8J, and I'm coming to the rationale and reasons for that. And I also think, which was mentioned already previously today, that the involvement in the informal advisory group on mainstreaming is really important. On the other hand, I think here some kind of cautious is also put on side. I think to be one member of this informal advisory group is not maybe the whole thing and not enough, but I think we should be involved in that, or the indigenous people and local communities should be involved in that group, definitely. And we heard that the Asian Center has nominated, but I think even more prominent IPLCs should be a part of that. Then we come to this institutional arrangement. Of course, why we should have it? It's of course the continuity, both related to the program of work, but also existing institutional arrangements that has been in place. It's a very strong rationale why. The participation should be full and effective, as also seen, and to increase the focus on implementation to achieve both the 2030 targets, but also the 2050 vision, including the other objectives, the 3 objectives of CBD and its protocols. I think also the efficiency compared to current arrangement, Article 8J and open-ended working or part of the SBI, I think one very important note in this efficiency is the right to make recommendations and draft decisions to the COP. So the voice of IPLCs I see as really important to have an own body. Otherwise, if you are going to be integrated in the SBI, the subsidiary body for implementation, I think we lose the voice of IPLCs and the advisory that it gives. Advisory role to the COP and its protocol. addressing the gaps and providing draft decisions. By IPLC on perspective concerning them, I think that's also the disclosure and the appreciation is really important, and also definitely the fulfillment of UNDRIP, which has also been mentioned today. What are then the pros and cons of this institutional arrangement? Of course, the pros are the continuation of work. This gives a strong mandate for IPLCs to continue. It also gives the disclosure of the knowledge and the traditional knowledge and the wisdom that it has. It also gives us the link to the SDGs and connecting to CBD. I think that gives the mandate for that as well. And then also the review and update of traditional knowledge, the set of indicators for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. The local biodiversity outlook was also mentioned. I think this is a really important part of the future work. Also, the new institutional arrangement gives us the tool for cooperation and improving synergies, and for the integration and implementation. Then the constraints, I think we have constraints with the technical backup by IPLCs and their involvement, including the financial means. I think this needs to be looked into. Also was mentioned the issue of the diversification of indigenous peoples and local communities. I think this is a really important issue to clarify in the future. Also, in the background document, we saw the list of elements for the for this work, and I think here we have 23 elements. Unfortunately, only 12 submissions all in all, and only 5 from parties, which is a concern. I think that we have a constraint with notifications and having the parties to give in their thoughts and the issues. South Africa, Canada, European Union, Colombia, if I remember right, was the parties who has given, but we still lack a lot of positions and thoughts in this regard. The cost implications of having a subsidiary body, for instance, how we cannot continue with having only voluntary contributions. In my opinion, it needs to be in the core budget, and these cost implications for being cost effective needs to be also put the rationale behind that. Then, of course, IPLCs. If we think about how the history has gone, I think they are very much better organized, but still who is speaking and deciding on the IPLCs? I think this is an issue that needs to be also clarified, who has the voice to speak for them, and the resources for traditional knowledge. Here is only a yeah, I'm going, sorry, just to be very short, I know I have a lot of thoughts, but the time frame is short. The consultations and the involvement, I think I already mentioned, the outcome existing guidelines should be worked, measuring the rate of implementation and appreciation. And my last slide is in the post-2020 biodiversity framework and considering this institutional arrangement, is communication and language an issue? How to manage consultations in the future and new partnership? Any advice on consideration, and what to congratulate the Indigenous people on their Indigenous Year of Indigenous Languages? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marina, for your presentation and for sharing more information on the Indigenous peoples of Finland, the Samis, and of course sharing all of this valuable insights and thoughts on the various options of integrating the work on Article 8J, whether it continues as a working group, whether it's integrated into the subsidiary bodies, and the pros and cons. And of course, this discussion will continue on the online forum on Equator Connect. So I encourage all of you, including yourself, Marina, to really support us there to provide more of this very valuable knowledge. We acknowledge it's already 10 a.m. and we have already reached the 2 hours. but I would just, if our panelists agree to this and our attendees are willing to wait for a couple more minutes, I'd like to share some of the questions we've received so far, and I will go with those on the chat box since we have several there. So I will choose a couple, and I encourage Hoda, if you can send us your question in the chat as well, and we will share it with our panelists. So thank you all so much for this exciting discussion and conversation. Definitely more to continue. So hi Danica, I'm Beatrice from Rwanda. It's true we can work with Indigenous peoples not just as beneficiaries, but as experts in the area. We work with local communities, traditional healers, during the development of the TK guidelines, and we realized that despite the fact that most of them did not go to formal school, they have more knowledge and can be called the expert in their areas. One question from Oindrila Basu to all the panelists. Migration of the Indigenous peoples causes dilution and fading away of many Indigenous valuable knowledge resources, as there is a notion among common people to see Indigenous knowledge as uncivilized superstition. How to address this fact? Hi, Elifuraha, here in Guyana. A project is underway that seeks to empower Indigenous communities through building capacity in participatory video. This supports them being the ones in control of acknowledging and sharing the issues and concerns they have regarding TK. The idea is that they can create short videos which can be used to engage decision makers, to bring attention to issues and voice their views and suggestions for future support and action that may be needed to address this. Beatrice says she also supports the idea of differentiating Indigenous peoples and local communities by having a clear definition and scope of application for each. And then we have a question from Carla Sofia Pital. Hello, this is Carla from CBD department at FAO. I am interested in knowing if there's any ongoing engagement with Afro-descendants in Latin on traditional knowledge and biocultural diversity. So lots of words congratulating our speakers, including from David Barkin for our Cree speaker. And then let's see, we have so many questions, colleagues. So hello from Georgia, Dr. Katka, President of Association for Farmers' Rights Defense, AFRD, country representative. So he's just sharing his information. And then hello, many thanks for the very diverse presentations. I would like to add one point from a more practical perspective of the implementation of ABS and Nagoya Protocol. So this is from Lena Fay. A major challenge that is repeatedly stressed by IPLCs we work with on the ground is that there is a lack of guidance and support for actually playing an active role at eye level in the implementation of ABS. I think an important element of the post 2020 framework should be to find ways to provide this kind of support, i.e. by developing guidance, e.g. community protocols, and perhaps by also creating opportunities for peer learning and experience exchange. So colleagues, with that, I leave the speakers with some of the thoughts. There are many more thoughts, and we would like to share these on the online forum, but we have run out of time, so I would encourage our speakers from the second segment to provide any closing thoughts or any thoughts to these comments. Thank you. So Danica, would you like to go first?
Thank you so much for the opportunity today. Thank you to the CBD Secretariat and to all those who participated in the forum, and to the person who made the initial comment. Thank you so much for that. I wish there were more of you in the world. And I encourage, sorry, my toddler's in the background. I encourage everybody to fully utilize the guidelines that have been established over the course of the lifespan of the CBD, along with the UN Declaration, to ensure that we have the proper framework moving forward. And I think obviously the main message is that Indigenous peoples can lead the way in a lot of respects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danica, for your thoughts. Pernilla, do you have any closing thoughts? Any thoughts on some of these comments? Elifuraha, would you have any comments?
Yes, I think likewise I should thank the CBD Secretariat as well as our attendees and the other panelists. I think it's been a very informative discussion, and the UN Permanent Forum, as usual, follows the work of the CBD with a lot of interest, and we hope to continue this collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Marina, any closing thoughts, any comments?
No, thank you. Thank you for my side as well. A lot to everybody. One issue is, of course, now, which is very near, is the 22nd of May, which will be the Health and Biodiversity, will be the main International Biodiversity Day. And I think the health, genetic resources, and TK related to food security, the varieties of crops and these issues are really interesting. And I hope that we could do a push for the International Biodiversity Day in that regard. Also, to Danica, I think this UN declaration is really good to remind ourselves on. Thank you, and let's continue the work. I think this is a really, really important and interesting process to the post-2020. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marina. And then, John, if you're online, if you couldn't microphone, I would like to give you the floor for any closing remarks and thoughts after this very fruitful discussion, and clearly there's space to continue discussing and sharing suggestions.
Thanks, Eva. It's been a very rich discussion. I've learned a lot from listening to people. It's I particularly like Danica's ideas on trying to create a new space, a different space where Indigenous peoples are permanent partners in the implementation of the convention. And I think that this is also supported by the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. Just to let people know, Marina was saying there's, I think there are more than 500 people registered. Some will listen to this afterwards and reflect on it. And we're going to have an online process that goes until the 12th of March, along with a survey. And Marina, you raised a very good issue. We have like 23 possible elements of work. There's some overlaps, some duplication, there's some tasks. Part of the questionnaire and the ongoing discussion is to ask Indigenous peoples, local communities, all of you who are participating, including the parties in this discussion, if you are to start to prioritize these elements of work. I'm looking ahead to what the working group, the 11th meeting of the working group, will look at as some kind of draft, and it will have to be a limited number of elements. It could be in 1 or 2 stages, and so nothing is left over. Those elements that are not prioritized could be retained as an annex of indicative elements should we need more. But the idea now is to massage this into something that could look like a program of work with prioritized elements and tasks underneath them. So this process and the questionnaire will really help us to do that. We really need your help. Also, there were various questions, including, and it often comes from the African region, the discussion on Indigenous peoples and local communities. I'm happy to have a bilateral discussion. The convention has done a lot of work on this. We've adopted advice about local communities, and back in 2011, we had an expert meeting with local community representatives. But of course, the CBD is not an Indigenous specific forum. It's a forum that's open to Indigenous peoples and local communities. So the tendency here is to work together, of course. So of course I can send that information bilaterally. Also, thank you for those of you who reminded us of the importance of the framework of the UN Declaration. Part of my job here is to look at progress towards Aceh Target 18 on traditional knowledge and towards achieving Article 8J and related provisions. And when I look at the very good principles and guidelines that we've developed over the years, the implementation of them at the national and local level is still very poor. And I think we would be in a much different position if all of those principles and guidelines had been implemented by the member states, including those member states who may not have recognized Indigenous peoples. They would still apply to local communities. And that would put us in a very different position. I think it will be different for the governments to consider possible international arrangements for traditional knowledge, which was hinted at by South Africa, when the governments themselves had not implemented what they've agreed to at a national level. So these are some of the politics that will be involved, of course, because this process will come to fruition at 8J, but after the 11th meeting of 8J in November, this work and the ideas for a program of work and institutional arrangements will dovetail into the post-2020 process for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So we have a window now until 8J. There'll be further discussions, of course, next May at the subsidiary bodies meetings, the Scientific and Technical Advice Bureau and the subsidiary body on implementation will also look at this again next May. But what is adopted at COP15 in November next year will guide us for the term future till 2050 towards the vision of the Convention of Humanity living in harmony with nature. So I'll stop there. This has been a very rich experience, and you're giving us some fodder to develop a draft proposal that the working group will look at. And please, I encourage you to continue the discussion in the online forum to involve more people, particularly we need more parties at the table. So that we have a good proposal for the working group when it meets later this year. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John, for those closing remarks. And as he mentioned, please join the discussion. Go to the Equator Connect website. The address is www.connect.equatorinitiative.org. And for all of you, Equator Connect is a community of practice that connects a variety of stakeholders through an interactive platform to share best practices, resources, successes, and challenges faced by local communities and Indigenous peoples through UNDP's Equator Initiative. So we encourage you to join, connect, and share resources and your questions and your thoughts. And UNDP's Equator Initiative brings together the United Nations, governments, civil society, businesses, and grassroots organizations to recognize and advance local sustainable development solutions for people, nature, and resilient communities. And we're always very happy to be collaborating with our colleagues at the CBD. So last reminder that we will share the link to the recording of today's webinar with all of you, and ask that you continue to engage in the discussion on Article 8J and related provisions by both answering the questions in the survey that you will receive shortly via email, and also again by sharing your thoughts and ideas online in the discussion forum. So on behalf of the organizing partners, thank you all again for your time and engagement and for staying a little bit longer to engage in this Q&A session. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much.